The dojo smelled of sweat, wood polish, and the faint tang of tatami mats that had absorbed decades of training falls. Bright fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, throwing a sterile glow over the wide space where hundreds had gathered. It wasn't just a seminar anymore, it was theater. Rows of young athletes in white judogi filled the edges of the mat, their belts tied tight, their eyes wide with expectation. Cameras clustered at the back, lenses like glassy eyes waiting to pounce. At the center stood Master Hideo Takamura, 70 years old but sharp-eyed, his hair silvered, his GI crisp and immaculate. He carried the authority of a man who had lived his entire life within the discipline of judo. His reputation in Japan was built on strictness and brutal honesty. That day, his voice carried not just authority, but provocation. He raised his hand to quiet the scattered applause and spoke in Japanese, though translators echoed him instantly into English for the gathered press. "Chuck Norris is a myth," he barked, his voice like a blade cutting the air. "Hollywood made him. On the tatami, he has nothing to show." The words crashed through the hall. There was a beat of stunned quiet, then laughter, first scattered, then rolling through the crowd like thunder. The younger judoka, especially, leaned forward, grinning, clapping their hands against their knees. They saw their master not only defending their art, but ridiculing an American legend they'd only known through television. The applause came sharp and mocking, a collective cheer not just for their teacher, but against the man whose name had been larger than life for decades overseas. Journalists scribbled furiously, their pens scratching headlines into notebooks before the moment had even finished. By evening, wires carried the soundbite around the globe. By morning, the front pages in Tokyo screamed, "Judo Master calls Norris a fraud." The phrasing traveled across oceans. In Los Angeles, New York, Dallas, the words ricocheted through talk shows and sports columns. For American audiences, the insult wasn't just aimed at Chuck Norris. It was a dart at the very fabric of the generation that had grown up with him as a symbol of toughness, grit, and a certain brand of American pride. In gyms across Texas, martial artists replayed the clip with folded arms, shaking their heads at the boldness. In diners across the Midwest, veterans and factory workers alike argued over whether Norris could or should answer. In Japan, meanwhile, the mood was triumphant. Takamura's declaration wasn't just about a man. It was about cultural ownership of authenticity. Inside the Tokyo seminar hall, the reaction was feverish. The master paced slowly, enjoying the rhythm of the crowd's approval. "A myth," he repeated, savoring the word, "and myths must always fall to truth." His tone dripped with finality, as though this wasn't merely an opinion, but a foregone conclusion. The younger judoka shouted encouragement, some rising slightly from their seats, fists pumping. The air filled with claps, laughter, even a few whistles. It was a celebration, but also a challenge, and everyone in the room knew it. The press smelled blood in the water. Their cameras flashed with each sharp gesture of Takamura's hand, each confident line etched deeper into his face. In the United States, however, the insult hit differently. Late-night hosts replayed the clip with exaggerated disbelief, some mocking Norris's age, others defending him with jokes that weren't quite jokes. But beneath the humor was a current of anger, of wounded pride. The statement wasn't just about one man's skills. It was about whether an American icon could be laughed off the stage by a foreign master. The split was immediate. Japan laughed and applauded. America bristled. And the stage for confrontation built itself without a single punch thrown. Back in Tokyo, as the seminar ended, the reporters crowded around Takamura, microphones bristling like bayonets. One asked directly, "If Norris were to come to Japan, would you meet him?" The master's grin widened, deep lines cutting across his cheeks. He bowed slightly, then straightened. "I welcome him," he said, "but here he will not find the safety of cameras. Here he will meet the tatami." The crowd roared approval, the sound rising into the rafters. Young judoka stomped their bare feet against the mats, the vibrations humming under the soles of everyone present. It wasn't just anticipation. It was hunger. They wanted to see the myth tested, broken, disproven before their eyes. Outside, the Tokyo evening was wet with spring rain. Neon bled into the puddles on the pavement. Reporters raced to transmit footage, their umbrellas bouncing against the crowd. The words, "Norris is a myth," repeated endlessly across TV screens and radios, replayed until they lost none of their sting. Across the Pacific, Chuck Norris was at home in Texas when the clip played on the evening news. He sat at a kitchen table, the TV glow reflecting in his eyes, saying nothing as the master's voice crackled through the broadcast. His hands folded calmly, but his jaw tightened once. The insult had traveled farther than Takamura might have expected. It was no longer just one man's provocation. It had become a clash of legends, a collision of pride stretched across continents. And the world, restless and waiting, demanded an answer. Just wondering, where are you watching from? Write it down, bellow. The arena in Tokyo was sold out days in advance. What had been pitched as a friendly seminar between two martial artists had transformed overnight into a spectacle. The posters outside no longer described a cultural exchange. They shouted in bold letters, "Truth versus." Myth Security struggled to control the line that wound around the block. Reporters lugged their equipment through the drizzle, umbrellas tilting as they jostled for space. Young judoka in crisp white uniforms stood shoulder to shoulder, buzzing with anticipation. Even the older generation came, their expressions harder to read. Some protective of their art, others wary of the noise surrounding it. Inside, the atmosphere crackled. The mats gleamed under harsh light, their green surface looking almost too clean, waiting for the weight of bodies. Rows of cameras circled the edge, red recording lights winking like tiny predators' eyes. Murmurs swelled and broke in waves as spectators settled. It didn't feel like a seminar anymore. It felt like a duel of nations. At one end of the arena, Master Takamura stood with his arms crossed, his presence sharp as a blade. He wore his gi with ceremonial precision, the black belt tied so tight it seemed fused to his waist. When he spoke, the microphones caught every syllable. "Myths disappear when touched," he declared, turning slightly so the press could catch his profile. "And today, we will see truth revealed." The crowd erupted in applause, shouts echoing from the rafters. Some stomped their bare feet against the bleachers, the sound like distant drums. The younger judoka cheered loudly, their pride swelling with every word. For them, this wasn't just about Chuck Norris. It was about proving that Japanese judo remained unshakable, untouchable. Behind the noise, a hush of English voices threaded through the crowd. American journalists had flown in from Los Angeles, New York, Dallas. They carried cameras and microphones, but also a mission: to defend the reputation of a man their audience back home still considered a living legend. To them, the event smelled less like a seminar and more like a trial. Backstage, Chuck Norris waited. He hadn't arrived with a retinue, no dramatic entrance. Just himself, a plain white gi folded neatly over his frame, his belt tied with the quiet confidence of someone who had done it 1,000 times. The fabric was worn, not showy, creased by practice, not pressed for performance. When the announcer called his name, the noise in the arena rose, then fractured. Some clapped, others laughed, and many simply leaned forward, waiting. He stepped onto the mat without a bow to the crowd, only a brief nod to the officials. No theatrics. His eyes scanned the room once, and then settled, calm and steady, on the tatami itself. The contrast was immediate. Takamura radiated sound and sharpness, his words slicing through microphones, his gestures large enough for the back rows. Norris was the opposite, quiet, grounded, unshaken. Where the master provoked, Norris absorbed. Where Takamura sought the crowd, Norris ignored it. And that silence unnerved people more than the insults had. The master couldn't resist another strike. He walked to the center, gesturing broadly to the stands. "My friends," he said, "you came to see judo. Real judo, not tricks from a cinema screen." He turned his eyes to Norris. "Here, there are no cameras to protect you. Here, only skill speaks." The crowd cheered, clapping in rhythm. A chant began, "Judo! Judo!" rolling like a wave. The American reporters exchanged looks, some shaking their heads, some scribbling furiously. Chuck walked to the center. His pace was even, unhurried. He bowed to the officials, then to Takamura, then simply stood in stance, hands relaxed, breathing calm. He said nothing. The silence that followed stretched long enough to make the noise uncomfortable. Even the crowd felt it, their chants faltering. Cameras zoomed, searching his expression for something, fear, irritation, bravado. They found none. Takamura's smile tightened. He was used to controlling a room with his words. But here was a man who gave him nothing to push against. The atmosphere sharpened. Every breath, every shuffle on the bleachers seemed amplified. It no longer felt like a friendly demonstration. It felt like the seconds before a storm breaks. Reporters leaned closer to the mats. The judoka in the stands straightened. A boy in the front row gripped the edge of his seat so hard his knuckles whitened. When the referee signaled for the first engagement, the crowd drew in a collective breath. The air in the arena thickened, waiting to be broken. Takamura stepped forward first, his GI swaying sharply with the movement. Norris shifted his weight, not aggressively, but with the certainty of someone who already understood what was coming. The duel of words had ended. The silence of action was about to begin. The referee's hand dropped, and the hall stilled as if the very air held its breath. Takamura circled first, feet whispering over the tatami. His movements were sharp, deliberate, the crispness of a man who had repeated these motions for decades. He lifted his arms high, projecting energy not only toward his opponent, but toward the audience. Every gesture exaggerated so the back rows could see. He spoke while he moved, his words translated almost instantly into English through the microphones. "Observe. This is real technique. Not fantasy. Not cinema tricks." His voice carried a confident lilt, drawing chuckles and nods from the crowd. He demonstrated a clean pivot, grabbed his assistant's sleeve, and flipped him to the mat with a thunderous thud. The assistant rose quickly, bowing, playing his part in the master's theater. Applause rattled the bleachers. Some of the younger judoka shouted encouragement, stamping their heels into the floor to send vibrations across the arena. Takamura turned, his eyes flashing at Norris. "Do you see? This is judo, real strength, real balance." He gestured toward the American to step closer. Norris did, without hurry, without expression. His GI looked unremarkable, even modest, creased from use, not presentation. He adjusted his belt once, bowed with minimal flourish, then settled into stance. His hands hung naturally at his sides, knees bent, posture grounded. He did not speak. The sudden quiet in the arena was startling. The master's voice had filled the space moments before, and now the silence around Norris seemed heavier than sound. Even the clicking of camera shutters slowed, reporters caught by the strangeness of the moment. Takamura seized it. He lunged forward, gripping Norris's sleeve and collar with practiced speed, his feet sliding into position for Seoi Nage, the classic shoulder throw. It was a move he had done thousands of times. The audience leaned forward as one, expecting the American to fly across the mat, confirming everything the master had promised. But the throw didn't happen. Norris didn't resist in a dramatic way. He simply didn't move. His feet rooted into the tatami, as though the floor itself refused to release him. His posture sank lower, shoulders heavy, weight distributed perfectly. Takamura pulled, twisted, adjusted, but nothing gave. His GI creaked under the strain, but the man in front of him might as well have been welded to the mat. For the first time all evening, the crowd made no sound. The silence rang louder than the applause ever had. The master gritted his teeth, his face flushing under the lights. He shifted his grip, tried again, driving his hips under Norris's center. The movement was textbook, sharp, explosive, designed to unbalance any opponent. Still, Norris's body barely tilted, his calm expression unchanging. A murmur rose, hesitant at first, from the front rows. Reporters craned forward, scribbling notes furiously. The young judoka blinked, confused. This wasn't the effortless throw they expected. Takamura grunted, his breath audible in the microphone, and yanked harder. His assistant on the sideline flinched, unused to seeing his teacher struggle. The crowd began whispering in low ripples, the silence of disbelief spreading like a chill. Norris finally moved, not to strike, not to counter, but to glance down at the hands gripping his GI. His expression remained neutral, but the stillness of his body sent a message louder than words. This is not enough. Takamura released his grip abruptly, stepping back, his chest heaving. He covered the moment by lifting his arms, addressing the crowd again. Do you see? He resists, but resistance without skill is nothing. His voice was firm, but a crack in the confidence showed itself. The crowd tried to rally, some applauding, some shouting encouragement. But the energy had shifted. The demonstration no longer felt controlled. Something had slipped. Norris adjusted his stance again, feet barely moving, shoulders rolling once as if loosening tension. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence made the crowd lean closer, as though the absence of words forced them to search his every gesture for meaning. The referee glanced between them, sensing the air change. He gestured for the engagement to continue, his movements cautious, almost reverent. Takamura, unwilling to retreat, surged forward again. This time he aimed lower, reaching for Norris's leg in a swift sweep. The crowd gasped as his foot hooked, his body twisting with expert timing. For a heartbeat, it looked like Norris might stumble, but he didn't. His leg absorbed the sweep as if it had been expected, his balance adjusting instantly. His hand barely lifted, but it was enough to break the rhythm, and Takamura found himself standing off balance for a split second, an instant that felt like an eternity in front of a silent, watching arena. The whispers grew louder. Even the American journalists, who had come wary and skeptical, leaned forward now with surprise flickering across their faces. For the first time in decades, perhaps, the Japanese master looked unsettled. His jaw tightened, his breathing sharper. He stepped back, circling again, no longer speaking to the crowd. His eyes locked on Norris, measuring him not as a prop for demonstration, but as an opponent. The myth hadn't been thrown. The myth hadn't bent. And in that pause, in that breathless stillness, the audience realized they weren't watching a seminar anymore. They were watching a storm gather. The master's jaw tightened as he circled again. His earlier confidence had curdled into something harder, angrier. He lunged forward with a sharp grip, twisting with full force into another shoulder throw. This time, there was no hint of a demonstration. His body snapped like a whip, veins rising on his neck, every tendon straining to drive the American into the mat. But the throw collapsed against silence. Norris shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, heels grounding into the tatami, hips lowering by the smallest fraction. Takamura's force met nothing solid to push against. The movement dissolved, spilling into empty space, as though the air itself had swallowed it. The master staggered half a step, forced to catch his balance. The audience gasped. A ripple of surprise passed through the bleachers. First disbelief, then a low wave of voices. Some of the younger judoka laughed nervously, unable to reconcile what they had just seen. Others leaned forward, mouths half open, their confidence in their teacher suddenly fragile. American reporters scribbled furiously, their pens moving as if to anchor the moment before it slipped away. For Takamura, the slip was unbearable. His face reddened, his breathing louder now, chest rising beneath the fabric of his GI. He bared his teeth and barked, "Stop! Enough games." His voice cracked through the microphone like a whip. "Now! Seriously!" The crowd erupted again, some cheering wildly, others uneasy with the tone. The chant of "Judo! Judo!" tried to rise, but it faltered, wobbling under the weight of doubt. The master didn't wait. He surged forward, his movements harsher, faster, combining grips and sweeps in a rapid sequence. His hands darted for Norris's collar, then his sleeve, yanking with practiced speed. His foot sliced for a trip, his hips twisted for leverage. The combination was textbook, executed with the sharpness of decades of mastery. But every strike met the same wall of stillness. Norris responded not with counters, but with balance. A tilt of his shoulders here, a shift of his stance there, each small correction leaving Takamura grasping at air. The audience could see it. The master was attacking, yet nothing landed. Every move unraveled, redirected into nothingness by calm, quiet adjustments. The silence in the arena deepened, pressing on ears heavier than the earlier noise. Even the camera shutters seemed muted, their clicks tentative. Spectators glanced at one another with wide eyes. The divide in the crowd sharpened. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others whispered urgently, trying to make sense of what was happening. Takamura's breath grew ragged. Sweat gathered at his temples, beating down his face, darkening the collar of his GI. His attacks grew wilder, fueled by frustration. He tried a foot sweep, then a hip throw, then another sharp pull at the sleeve. Each time, Norris's body absorbed the motion and returned it as emptiness. It was no longer a demonstration. Everyone in the room could feel it. The polite curtain between show and contest had been torn away. This was no exhibition of judo technique against an American actor. This was a fight for dignity. The young judoka in the front row no longer cheered. Their faces had hardened, eyes darting between their master and the silent man across from him. The American journalists leaned forward, sensing a shift they could carry back across the ocean. The arena itself seemed to grow hotter, the air thicker, every sound magnified. Norris had not spoken a word. His face remained neutral, his breathing steady, even as Takamura's chest heaved with effort. The contrast between them grew unbearable to watch. One final attempt. Takamura roared, charging with a furious combination. Grip, sweep, twist, all his strength poured into the attack. But Norris stepped aside, barely moving, and the master stumbled past him, his foot scraping against the mat. The silence that followed was suffocating. No one laughed this time. No one cheered. The entire arena understood. Something irreversible had shifted. What began as theater was now stripped bare. They were no longer watching a performance. They were watching the line between pride and humiliation thin to the point of breaking. And everyone knew what had to come next. The referee gave a cautious signal, but all eyes were already locked on the two men in the center of the mat. Takamura's breathing had grown audible, each inhale scraping through clenched teeth. Sweat darkened the edges of his GI, glistening on his forehead under the lights. His face was taut, no trace of humor left, just the hard mask of pride pushing him forward. He snapped into his stance and advanced, faster this time. His hand shot to Norris's collar, fingers clawing for control, while the other gripped the sleeve tight. This was the entry everyone knew, his trademark throw, practiced to perfection over decades. The crowd leaned in, thousands of bodies collectively holding their breath. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the throw that would bury the so-called myth once and for all. The master heaved, twisting with practiced force, his GI strained with the torque, the cords in his neck standing out like ropes. His entire body coiled, then snapped. And yet, nothing happened. Norris shifted just slightly, sinking his weight, his hips sliding half an inch off the line of attack. It wasn't a block. It wasn't even defiance. It was absence. Takamura's force poured into empty space, as though the floor itself had swallowed it whole. His balance slipped. His momentum rolled away from him like water spilling off stone. Gasps rippled through the arena. Some laughed nervously, as though laughter might explain the impossible. Others pressed their hands to their mouths, eyes wide. The younger judoka in the front row blinked in disbelief, their image of invincibility suddenly cracking. Reporters scrambled to scribble notes, pens racing across paper, knowing this moment would be replayed across the world. But Takamura was not finished. He reset with a sharp grunt, breath ragged, and launched again. His foot hooked for a sweep, his hips cut low for leverage, his hands yanked with violent precision. Every muscle in his body screamed effort. His GI flapped sharply with each movement, sleeves snapping like flags. And again, Norris refused to be moved. A small rotation of his shoulders, a subtle change in angle, and the attack unraveled in midair. The audience could see it. Every technique collapsed before it landed, dismantled by adjustments so quiet they looked almost like stillness. The silence in the arena deepened, heavy and suffocating. The earlier cheers were gone. Even the chants had died. All that remained was the sound of shoes squeaking on the tatami, the harsh rhythm of Takamura's breathing, and the unnerving calm of Norris, whose chest rose and fell with the serenity of a man in meditation. The master's face flushed darker. Sweat rolled down his jaw. He threw himself into a combination, snapping between grips and sweeps, stringing together a flurry of attacks in desperation. His body still knew the language, but his words no longer landed. Each strike dissolved into void, redirected by invisible hands. And then came the breaking point. With a roar, Takamura seized Norris's collar and sleeve one more time, dragging him into position for the finishing throw that had ended countless contests. His voice cracked in anger. "Now!" The audience rose to their feet, desperate for resolution. But Norris moved first. His right hand slid up Takamura's arm, catching the wrist with surgical precision. His left hand gripped the seam of the GI at the back, quiet but absolute. He pivoted, his heel whispering against the tatami, his hips threading just beneath Takamura's center of gravity. The master, fully committed, couldn't withdraw. For a heartbeat, both men froze in perfect symmetry. Then Takamura's feet left the ground. The audience inhaled as one. A wave of sound swept the arena. Gasps, shouts, a few strangled cries. The master's body lifted, weightless, the familiar mechanics of his own throw twisted back against him. And then he fell. The impact was low and heavy, a deep thud that resonated through the tatami and into the chests of everyone watching. No brutal slam, no violence, just gravity reclaiming a man who had given it no choice. Takamura's grip slipped free, his body rolling onto the mat with the awkwardness of someone unaccustomed to being on the receiving end. The silence that followed was absolute. No applause, no cheers, no chants, just stunned stillness. 1,000 pairs of eyes stared at the figure on the ground and the man who remained standing. Norris did not raise his arms. He did not gesture to the crowd. He simply stood, posture unchanged, expression steady, his breathing calm as if he'd done nothing more than shift a chair across a room. The crowd began to murmur, the sound growing, folding in on itself. Some whispered in disbelief, some shook their heads, others muttered to themselves in awe. A few Americans in the press row exchanged glances that said more than their pens could. On the floor, Takamura lay staring at the rafters. His chest rose and fell in heavy rhythm, his breath loud in the hushed arena. He wasn't hurt, but the impact had struck deeper than muscle or bone. His pride, the bedrock of decades, had been shaken. He sat up slowly, blinking at the lights, sweat dripping into his eyes, his hands pressed against the mat, steadying himself. All around, the audience waited to see how he would answer. Rage, denial, another attack? But Norris remained still, giving him space, offering nothing but silence. And that silence pressed heavier than any victory shout. The crowd leaned forward, waiting. They sensed what came next might matter even more than the throw itself. Takamura stayed seated on the mat for a long moment, his palms flat against the surface, chest rising and falling. The fall hadn't broken him, but it had cracked something deeper, the certainty that his dominance was untouchable. His students leaned forward anxiously, but no one dared call out. He rolled onto one knee, then pushed himself upright. His face was pale beneath the flush of exertion, strands of damp hair sticking to his forehead. When his eyes lifted, they no longer carried the fierce glare of a challenger. They carried something quieter. Confusion, yes, but also a dawning respect that surprised even him. Norris stood across from him, posture steady, breathing measured. He hadn't moved since the throw, hadn't pressed his advantage. His hands hung relaxed at his sides, as if he were waiting for something only Takamura could decide. The silence stretched, thick and expectant. Then, in a gesture that seemed to ripple through the hall like a shock wave, Norris extended his hand. It wasn't theatrical. His palm was steady, his expression unchanged, his stance unshaken. But the meaning was undeniable, an invitation to stand not as defeated and victor, but as equals. For a beat, Takamura hesitated, his pride balked, his jaw tight. The audience leaned forward, thousands of eyes holding their breath. The cameras zoomed, capturing the space between two hands, the most electric distance in the world at that moment. Finally, Takamura lifted his own hand and placed it in Norris's. The hall erupted. Applause thundered, filling every corner of the arena. It started scattered, then surged into a tidal wave of sound. People rose to their feet, clapping until their palms stung. Some shouted, some whistled, others simply stood silently, eyes shining with the recognition that they had witnessed a moment that would outlive the evening. Takamura's chest heaved, but his grip was firm. He allowed Norris to help him upright. Their eyes met, one man's filled with a grudging but undeniable respect, the other's steady, with the calm of someone who had nothing left to prove. Norris inclined his head slightly, then finally spoke, his voice low, but carrying through the microphone clipped nearby. "Myths live because there is truth in them," he said. "And the truth is discipline. The truth is respect." The words were simple, but they carved the silence cleanly. The translators repeated them, but they didn't need to. The meaning transcended language. For a moment, even the applause faded into a kind of reverent hush. Then Takamura did something none of his students expected. He bowed, low, deliberate, his forehead nearly grazing the mat. The crowd gasped, then cheered louder. Some of the younger judoka moved to tears. It wasn't just a bow to a man, it was an acknowledgement of what had just taken place, a recognition of dignity beyond borders. Norris returned the bow with equal measure, his motion unhurried, genuine. Then he turned, walking calmly toward the edge of the mat. He didn't wave to the crowd or pause for photographs. He simply left, with the same quiet composure he had carried in, his steps measured, his gaze forward. Behind him, the applause didn't die down. It grew. People clapped, standing, some stomping the wooden bleachers, some chanting his name, others shouting simply to release the weight of the moment. The sound carried long after Norris had disappeared down the corridor. Takamura remained at the center, breathing hard, his students surrounding him silently. He looked at them with a tired but clear expression, then raised one hand as if to calm them. They understood. They bowed as one, their respect not diminished, but reshaped. In the seats, the journalists typed frantically, knowing the headlines had already written themselves. The story wasn't about humiliation. It was about the thin line between legend and truth, and how, on that night, both had found their place on the same mat. Later, when the lights dimmed and the crowd spilled into the Tokyo streets, the noise of the city returned. Neon buzzed, rain hissed on asphalt, voices chattered in every direction. But those who had been inside the arena carried something different back into the night. They had seen more than a contest. They had seen pride, silence, control, and the simple gesture of a hand extended across rivalry. In the end, it wasn't the throw that stayed with them. It was the image of the old master bowing and the quiet man walking away while the sound of standing applause followed him long after he was gone.